Okay, so we're about to look at something quite in depth, and just to clarify, before I start these videos, I do not have a consensus beforehand that I'm planning to try and reach. I just have a question, I take the question, I break it down into smaller questions, and then I attack those questions by looking at each side. So I don't know what the answer is going to be to this, but what I do know is this is going to be very complicated and a very long video. So strap in, I might have to make this into multiple parts, because people have terrible fucking attention spans. Fix your attention span, you dumb fucking cunt. The question we'll be tackling today is, are transgender people really born in the wrong body, or is it a delusion? Because I don't fucking know at this point, bro. Like, I've argued this with so many people, and at one point I had the idea that, no, they were born in the wrong body, they can't help it. And on the other hand, after a while I was like, actually it's a delusion, they shouldn't do it. And then I went back and forth to back and forth. I don't know the answer to this question. Every side, has a good point. I can't seem to reach a consensus on the question. And a lot of people are going to be up in their seats right now because, oh, you're giving the alt-right a platform by looking at their views. Yes, if you want to call them the alt-right, I am giving them a platform for their views, and then I'm going to fucking attempt to destroy their views, and I'm also going to attempt to destroy the left's views, and then the right's views again, and then the left's views again, until we destroy everyone's fucking views and reach a single conclusion and figure out the truth, or something that seems to indicate a more logical answer than just constant political bickering. The first thing we're going to be defining, right, because we've got to define what we mean. This is already controversial, so we're getting right into the meatiness of this, is what defines a transgender person. How are we defining it? We're defining it as someone who has gender dysphoria. That's controversial, but that's how we're defining it. If you want me to make another video looking into it, I will, but I don't think anyone's really going to care that much. And for the current topic, we're looking specifically at the medical side of it for a lot of the time. And that's even more controversial because there's a lot of controversy around whether they should get the medical treatment on insurance or the NHS and stuff like that. But we're going to be looking at the people we can 100%, or at least the people we think we can 100% confirm to need this treatment. If you can call it treatment, which we'll also be looking into. Is the treatment viable? That's one of the questions we'll be looking at. And the reason, just to clarify, the reason that I am not just going to go off camera to make a consensus about it, then come back and explain, is because people, they cite a lot of sources, but when people cite these sources, they often only cite sources from the argument that they are fighting. They don't, why would they cite you sources to something that proves something against their point? They wouldn't do it. So with this, I'll be showing the sources I'm using, I'll be showing the statistics I'm using, the thought processes that go into analysing the statistics, and the statistics will be from, ideally, a lot of unbiased sources, but also from biased sources on both sides to even it out, because statistics can be made by biased people, believe it or not. So to kick it off, let's break down our main question into a bunch of smaller questions. Now, while these are 100% subject to be changed, whether that be certain questions removed because they're not relevant, or certain questions added because they needed to be added, they are subject to be changed. But from what I've got currently, these are the questions that I've got down. What defines delusion? What is sex? What defines sex objectively? Is it binary? Is sex the same as gender? Is sex objective? What is gender? Is gender related to sex? What defines gender? Can it be fluid? What is gender dysphoria? What's its history? What causes gender dysphoria? Is the treatment used viable and or medically ethical? Does sex reassignment surgery work? Does HRT work? Does gender affirmation therapy work? What does it mean for them to work? Is there better medical options? Considering the other options, what treatments would be worth the risk? If it's a delusion, is the current medical practice ethical? What does it mean to be born into the wrong body? Can you even be born into the wrong body? Can you really change the body you were born into? Those are the questions I have down for now. as again, they are subject to be changed. So if you don't see any of them in the video, I removed them. If you see ones that weren't here, I added them. But as you see, we have quite a lot of questions to get through, and there's most definitely going to be more added onto that I just haven't thought of. So where should we start? Because those were not in any particular order. Let's start off with a question and let's look at it. First off, let's define delusion, because I think that's very important, as this is one of the words we use in our question, so we should probably define it before we ask the question. There's two definitions here, so I think we should actually go by both of them. And when we're asking this question, we should see whether they fit either definition of delusion. So the first definition is a belief that is not true, a false idea. The second definition is a false idea or belief that is caused by mental illness. So I guess a good thing to ask next is, does gender dysphoria count as a mental illness? Well, how are we going to define mental illness? Now, this is where it can become very opinion-based, and this is why it's very difficult to get to the bottom of this question, so we're going to have to look at opinions. But just to get a grounding, let's look at how the American Psychiatric Association defines mental illness. What is mental illness? Mental illnesses are health conditions involving changes in emotion, thinking, or behaviour, or a combination of these. Mental illnesses are associated with distress and or problems functioning in social, work, or family activities. This leads us on to the meat of the video, which is, what is gender dysphoria? And to answer that question, we are first going to need to look at what is gender. While words can evolve, I think what we're first going to do is I want to find a definition before this became a big talking point in the mainstream. Like, I want to find a definition from before it was politicized. This is to prevent as much bias as we can when looking at it. So I used the Wayback Machine on the Wikipedia for gender, and let's look at it. So we have a definition here from February 15th, 2004, which is before I was even alive. I was not breathing. But the main thing I think we should use here is what the social scientists have used for the past almost 2 decades now. At the least, it's probably been longer, but since this Wikipedia page has been alive. And I know Wikipedia isn't the be-all and end-all, but it's a good indicator. So first it says that it's commonly used as a synonym for sex referring to males and females, but what it was commonly used for isn't necessarily its technical term. So social scientists use gender to refer to a particular social identity, status, and cluster of roles that are often but not exclusively determined on the basis of sex. So from what we can tell by this definition, while it's common that the gender and the sex of someone aligns, the social scientists for decades now have been under the impression that they are separate things. So we can clarify that gender and sex are not the same thing, but let's try and get a more objective definition, and maybe we should look at the social scientists for a good definition for it. So I found this article from 2005. By the way, the reason I'm using older articles is because current day, if a large organisation defines something like gender in a way that doesn't fit the political status quo, then they get torn to shit. So they kind of don't have a choice without getting incomplete shit. So just to make sure we get an objective definition, I'm going to a time when you could define it as whatever you want and no one would really care besides a very small group of people. So that's why I'm using old articles. So this is what this article says. In the most basic sense, sex is biologically determined and gender is culturally determined. The noun sex includes the structural, functional, and behavioural characteristics of living things determined by sex chromosomes. Sex is derived from the Latin word sexus, meaning either of two divisions of organic nature distinguished as male or female respectively. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, sex is a definition as the sum of those differences in the structure and function of the reproductive organs on the ground of which beings are distinguished as male and female, and of the other physiological differences consequent on these, the class of phenomena with which these differences are concerned. Gender can be thought of as the behavioural, cultural, or psychological traits typically associated with the one sex. Gender is derived from the Latin word genus, referring to kind or race. Gender is defined as a kind, sort, or class referring to the common sort of people. It is through an understanding of these principal definitions that scientists can apply these terms in a specific manner to sex-based research. So, in my notes where I've got what is gender, we have 3 sub-questions to explain what gender is. Is gender related to sex? What defines gender? Can it be fluid? So we're going to look through all of these now. Is gender related to sex? Yes, but it is not the same as sex. Gender refers to the commonly associated social, cultural, and/or psychological attributes of one's sex. Therefore, when people identify as a gender that is not commonly associated with their sex, it means they more closely identify with the social, cultural, and/or psychological characteristics that is commonly associated with the opposite sex. What defines gender? Gender refers to the commonly associated social, cultural, and/or psychological attributes of one's sex. Can it be fluid? By definition, yes. As people change over time, they may feel they associate more closely with a different gender. Okay, well, I am quite taken aback because up until, I guess, a few minutes ago, I was well under the idea that gender and sex are the same thing, but it turns out I was wrong. That is the beautiful thing about actually looking into shit and not just blindly thinking about it. But yeah, I am quite taken aback by my findings. Now that we've defined gender, let's define the second word in the term gender dysphoria, which is dysphoria. This one should be a nice and easy one. A nice, refreshing research task after what I have just looked through. My god, bro, there is some fucking hilariously like fucked up articles from 2005 and 2004 and 7 and just the early to mid 2010. Bro, that was a wild ride. Dysphoria, a state of feeling very unhappy, uneasy, or dissatisfied. Okay, so if we use our sexy human brains here, we can decipher the meaning, which would be dysphoria about their gender, which might not make sense initially, but I think if we use our sexy human brains a bit more, we can decipher further that it is a state of dysphoria related to the gender of which they are socially perceived to be. But maybe our sexy human brains were wrong, or maybe mine was wrong, maybe you got it right. But let's look at a definition by a medical organisation. So this is again from the American Psychiatric Association. What is gender dysphoria? The term transgender refers to a person whose sex assigned at birth, i.e. the sex assigned by a physician at birth, usually based on the external genitalia, does not match their gender identity, i.e. one's psychological sense of their gender. Some people who are transgender will experience gender dysphoria, which refers to psychological distress that results from an incongruence between one's sex assigned at birth and one's gender identity. Though gender dysphoria often begins in childhood, some people may not experience it until after puberty or much later. But why didn't we just do that in the first place? Why didn't we just look up what it meant? Because we need to know what we're talking about. That's why, alright? If they said something that did not fit correctly to our research on the topic, then we can know that they are either not trusted or that they're talking about a separate thing and that they're talking about the thing that we're not talking about but using the same words. And that's why semantics is important. This is a side rant, but a lot of people will say, oh, we're just arguing semantics. Yeah, we're arguing semantics and it's fucking important. You need to argue semantics so you use language effectively. Language is how we communicate ideas and concepts in the most efficient way we know how to. If we're using language, but the other person is perceiving the way we're using our language in a different way, then it's failed at good communication. So we need to define what we mean so we can communicate effectively and get our points across, and also understand the opposing side's points. Now, to answer the question of is gender dysphoria a mental illness, let's look back at what a mental illness is real quick, and then what gender dysphoria is real quick. What is a mental illness? Mental illnesses are health conditions involving changes in emotion, thinking or behaviour, or a combination of these. Mental illnesses are associated with distress and/or problems functioning in social, work or family activities. And gender dysphoria is a psychological distress that results from an incongruence between one's sex assigned at birth and one's gender identity. Okay, now it seems pretty straightforward, but I just want to point something out. Now, mental illnesses, we've just defined that, but it says it involves changes in emotion, thinking or behaviour. If someone is born with it, does it count as a mental illness? I'd say maybe. I don't know. We need to look into that. Because my thought process is, if they're born with it, it's not changing their emotions, thinking or behaviour, because they've always felt, thought and behaved like that. So there's this website called Mental Health Zone, which basically has a bunch of like psychiatrists and therapists and stuff that answer questions on the website. And someone asked the question we're thinking of right now. And the general consensus of the replies is that you're not really born with mental illnesses, but you can be genetically predisposed. So there is some questions to be brought up here. There's not many studies that indicate whether people are born with gender dysphoria or whether it's developed over time. I'd assume it's genetically predisposed, but it's a pretty fat assumption to make, which I want to make this as objective as I possibly can. So I don't want to just say that right off the bat, but there has been studies showing a potential genetic link, so let's look at the abstract of one of these studies. But then on top of that study, there's also an extra interesting piece of information which indicates that what the study shows has some pretty good weight to it. Evidence suggests that abnormal biological processes, including mutations in certain genes, can lead to abnormal gonadal development, causing some fetuses to present with indifferent gonads and to be reassigned at birth to the default sex. This disparity in genetic influences relates to an increased likelihood of a diagnosis of GD. An investigation into complete androgen insensitivity syndrome involving androgen receptor AR gene mutation suggests that such individuals also experience gender dysphoria. It is known that the brains of males and females are different. Evidence further suggests that brain anatomy and neuronal signaling pathways are more closely aligned with the person's perceived gender identity. Individuals who present with discordant gonadal and brain developments experience psychological challenges that may contribute to a state of unease or generalized dissatisfaction with their biological sex. These point to a possible biological and genetic underpinning of GD, which is gender dysphoria, as stemming from a discordance between gonadal and brain development. However, not enough evidence has associated these differences with gender dysphoria. Further research is required to elucidate the true mechanisms and possible inheritance pattern of gender dysphoria for a better education and greater understanding by clinicians and the general public on perceptions regarding gender dysphoria. In human terms, it's essentially saying that there's possibly a link between someone's natural, so they're genetically inherited, sensitivity to androgen, which is a hormone, and whether they develop gender dysphoria or not. Past me was wrong, what a dumb cunt. Turns out androgen is not a hormone. Androgen describes a lot of different hormones that bind to the androgen receptors. So there's lots of different hormones that bind to the androgen receptors, and those hormones are considered androgens. Also, forgive me for this next clip of me talking because I recorded that before I realised that, so I did refer to androgen as a singular hormone. So this is where it's interesting. This study states the fact that there is a link, possibly, between in utero exposure to androgens and autism spectrum disorder. The interesting thing about this is that there is also a link to show that people with autism are more likely to have gender dysphoria than the average person. Which, when you link the two, seems very interesting and gives a lot of credence to the theory that androgen exposure could be linked to either one. So while this is just a theory, this is the best theory that I'm aware of that we have. So what I'm going to go with is that from the evidence I've seen, I think gender dysphoria is caused by genetic factors based off the evidence we've seen, which would give credence to the idea that it is indeed a mental illness. If there is any other theories you are aware of, please comment them in the comments so I can look at them and reevaluate my stance and reevaluate this entire video. And as annoying as that would be, when you're looking for the answer, it doesn't matter what's ideal for you, which is sad, because I really don't want to have to go over this again, but I might have to if I am proven to be incorrect in the theory I am going with. So, the theory we're going with for this video is that we don't know, but evidence suggests to the idea that it is a mental illness. So I'm going to go off the idea that this is a mental illness. So this is what I've wrote down under the question of is gender dysphoria a mental illness, just so we can be clear on exactly why I'm considering it a mental illness, just to summarise what we've just went over. Is gender dysphoria a mental illness? While there is no definitive answer as to whether or not a person is born with gender dysphoria or whether it's genetically predisposed and or caused by environmental factors, evidence suggests that it is caused in part due to genetics. This conclusion is due to the fact that it acts like a mental illness, and also there is a link between someone's sensitivity / in utero exposure to androgen and gender dysphoria, as well as a link between autism spectrum disorder, ASD, and sensitivity / exposure to androgen in utero, which is significant as there's also a link between ASD and gender dysphoria. Going off the basis that you are not born with it out of the box, and it is instead down to genetic and possibly environmental factors causing it to develop as time passes, I would consider gender dysphoria as a mental illness, as it often causes a change in emotion, thinking and or behaviour, and is associated with strong levels of distress, and can even cause problems with functioning socially due to this deep distress. Okay, so is gender dysphoria a delusion? No, because as we went over earlier, we discovered that gender dysphoria is, you can change that identity, not gender. We discovered gender was subjective in a sense. So gender dysphoria technically isn't delusional. But the main question of this whole video is are transgender people really born in the wrong body, or is it a delusion? Now, we did a lot of research. Well, I did a lot of research. You sat on your fucking lazy ass and watched me. But regardless, we should probably look over what sex is. And I did actually put the answers down for this already when I was researching gender, as a lot of it came up in what I was looking at. So let's look at the questions I asked for what is sex and look at the definitions that we've laid out. What is sex? What defines sex objectively? Either of the two divisions designated female and male by which most organisms are classified on the basis of their reproductive organs and functions. Is it binary? Yes, sex is derived from the Latin term sexus, defined as either of two divisions of organic nature distinguished as male or female respectively, and sex being defined as, we've just went over that, Is sex the same as gender? No. Is sex objective? Yes. Now, we're getting to the end, and I don't know how long the end is going to be, so I don't know if the video is going to end anytime soon. I highly doubt it. But the next question I'm going to ask, because I have the answer written down already, and we've already got it, is can you really change the sex of the body you were born into? Which is no, sex is objective. So you can't change the sex of the body you were born into. You can only try and make it look like the opposite sex. And I know people will be saying, well, they can, get their genitalia, removed, inverted, whatever the fuck. They can, but it's still not the opposite sex's genitalia, it just looks like it. If you could somehow create the functions to the degree of which is similar to that of the opposite sex's average person, then there is definitely an argument for that you could change it. There is definitely an argument there. The next question is, can you even be born into the wrong body? Is that even possible? We looked into androgen insensitivity syndrome earlier when talking about this, but there is actually something called complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, where people their androgen receptors get deformed to the degree that they can't use testosterone in their body. Their body doesn't recognize testosterone because the receptor is fucked. It just doesn't work. So you could argue that yes, someone can be born into the wrong body. Obviously, metaphorically, they're not literally born into the wrong body. Their body just didn't develop how it was naturally meant to develop. But with gender dysphoria, we don't actually see that someone developed in a way that they shouldn't have. They have developed how they should have developed. They just feel differently inside. But it doesn't, from what we know from the research, it's not linked to a developmental disorder like complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. If it was solely down to the factor of sensitivity to androgen, and while that does while it seems to play a factor, I imagine there's a lot more other factors that go into it. It's rarely ever the case that something only has one thing that factors into it. It was useful in determining that it probably is genetically predisposed. I highly doubt that it's the only contributing factor to whether someone has gender dysphoria, which is why I'm very wary about using it as a full reason as to explain gender dysphoria. Although I am willing to use it as a reason to explain how gender dysphoria is a mental illness, as it shows a link between genetics and gender dysphoria. And due to the fact it's genetic, it means you're not born with it, which means that it develops over time, which means it causes a change in your brain mentally, instead of just being how you were from birth. But yeah, if it was solely down to androgen insensitivity, then that wouldn't really make sense for it to be solely due to that, because then it wouldn't affect women, because women don't need their androgen receptors as much as males do for their development. So I just don't see how an insensitivity to androgen would make them want to become males, because they'd have less exposure to masculine types of hormones like testosterone. So I don't see how it could be a problem with developmental disorders unless it's a neurodevelopmental disorder, which there is some studies for. Now, this is a very interesting study. This is an insanely interesting study, actually. So the study is titled "Specific Cerebral Activation Due to Visual Erotic Stimuli in Male to Female Transsexuals Compared with Male to Female Controls," an fMRI study. So essentially, they put a bunch of women and male to female transsexuals in an fMRI machine thingy, and they showed them a movie, and it turned out that male to female transsexuals responded similar, their brains responded similar to that of which the female brains responded, which is quite interesting, actually. So it could be a developmental disorder. a neurodevelopmental disorder. And for you lazy cunts that won't read it, this was before they had undergone any type of medical intervention. So they weren't on hormones, they hadn't changed anything. So just in their completely natural state. So the moment of truth, I have came to a conclusion. We have got the answer to the question, kind of, are they born into the wrong body? Drum roll, please. Actually, don't play a drum roll. But research suggests that while they were born into the correct body, their brain did not develop in a way that matches their sex. And the reason I say that matches their sex is because sex is based off bodily developments. The genitalia, the sex characteristics. It's not based off the brain. What is based off the brain is gender. So gender, I guess you could say, is like the brain's sex. The reason I'm going to say the body didn't develop wrong and that it was instead the brain that developed wrong is because you can detect what a person's sex is going to be in the womb before their brain's developed, or at least before their brain has got to a point in development in which it is anywhere near significant to representing the sex of the person. So I am going to consider it a neurodevelopmental disorder. And is it a delusion? Sometimes. Sometimes people are just misinformed. It's not a delusion if you're just misinformed. It is a delusion, however, if you are informed and you still insist that you know. You just know. Then it's a delusion. So in some cases, it can be a delusion. So just to summarise the final answer, people with gender dysphoria are not born into the wrong body. Their brain just develops in a way that does not represent their sex. And sometimes people are deluded into thinking that they are actually the opposite sex in the wrong body, but not all the time. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you liked it, I don't really care, but the YouTube algorithm does, so like the video. If you disliked it, I apologise, but I don't really care. I do care as to why you disliked it. I just don't care that you disliked it. You're worthless. Fuck you. I'm joking. Anyway, this video might get took down, even though I was making completely logical arguments and I was using evidence and I was basing it off things that I had researched. So I hope it doesn't get took down, because I'm not just sitting here giving my subjective viewpoint, although that was sprinkled in throughout. I was just giving the evidence that I collected and the data that I could find, and just laying out the cards on the table, laying out my exact thought process, and if anyone has a problem with it, they can comment about it. So I hope this doesn't get took down. And as a final note, I don't care what you do, okay? I don't care if you go get a sex change. I don't care if you do hormone therapy. I don't care if you want to identify as fucking a million different pronouns at the same time. I don't care. Do what you want. This video isn't meant to make you seem invalidated. If it made you feel invalidated, you have a very fragile sense of self that I highly recommend getting a bit more confidence, because this is a YouTube video, not someone sat in front of you insulting you. But I don't care what you do. I don't give a fuck, and I don't hate anyone because of it. At the end of the day, I'm not gonna go out in public and see a trans person be like, I'm born in the wrong body, and go up to them and be like, well, actually, you're not born in the wrong body. You have a neurodevelopmental disorder. I'm not doing that. I don't care what you do. This is just a bit of fun and a bit of, just playing with ideas and stuff. And while, yes, these ideas do come to logical truths of how things are, it is still just a bit of fun. And you could argue maybe that I am somehow increasing alt-right ideas, but I'm not trying to push a political ideology. I can't stand politics. Whether you're right or left, I do not care. That whole thing is just made to divide people. I'm not bothered by any of that shit. I don't care about the politics of it all. I'm just I'm just looking at the facts of what it is, and maybe they're not facts, and maybe I was wrong in some parts of the video, but from what I know and the knowledge I've gathered, I've come to a consensus. And if you think that my consensus is wrong, respond to me somehow. If you don't want to engage on the video and you don't want to give my video any engagement, I'm pretty sure I have an email in my channel description. I might not, but if I do, email that. If not, like, I don't know, fucking go to my Instagram. It's @psychedelicgranny. Right, go there, message me there. And I'm gonna be honest, before you do that, unless you've got some valid counterpoints and you actually want to have a conversation, like, I don't care about what you're going to say unless you have something of substance. Like, if you're going to come at me and message me because, like, I hurt your feelings, or because I, like, don't agree with you despite the fact that you don't really have much of an argument to give, then I don't care about what you're saying, and I will ghost you or block you, or just, I'm going to probably ignore you. Unless you have some valid points to make in which I'll listen. Like, if I hurt your feelings by this video, I apologise. It was not my intention, but you sat through it. You got to this point. It's like, that's on you. Anyway, goodbye.